Okay, folks, I think we'll get started. It's 11:29. Give us an extra minute, because I have a feeling we're going to have a lot to say. So I'm going to introduce everybody first. I'm really excited to be doing this panel because I, of course, have written a lot of erotica, as probably most of you have who are here. And I also teach a class on writing the erotic at UCLA, which I've taught for 8 years. So this subject is exciting and interesting and provocative and et cetera. So I'm going to just do this alphabetically using the program here. So Drew Banks is a Memphis-raised San Francisco-based novelist who's written and published 4 books, including 2 business books with Jossie Bass Wiley. His novels, Abel Was I and Ere I Saw Elba, are the first 2 books of a trilogy exploring issues of physical and emotional exile. In December 2025, after a 15-year hiatus, Drew published the trilogy's 3rd novel, I Before E. Then we have Dr. Laurinda D. Brown Johnson. She is an award-winning author, playwright, and scholar whose work explores Black cultural production, identity, and community across genres. A Memphis native and Howard University graduate, she is the Lambda Literary Award-winning author of multiple novels and stage works. She currently serves as English Program Coordinator and Writing Center Director at Dillard University. Laurinda is currently co-directing and executive producing SCORE, Walk Like a Man at 20, a commemorative staging celebrating 2 decades of her groundbreaking theatrical work. And then we have Michael Lowenthal. Michael Lowenthal is the author of a story collection, Sex with Strangers, and 4 novels, The Same Embrace, Avoidance, Charity Girl, a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, and a Washington Post Top Fiction of 2007 pick, and The Paternity Test, an Indie Next Selection and a Lambda Literary Award finalist. The recipient of fellowships from the MacDowell Colony and the Breadloaf Writers Conference, he was also awarded the James Duggins Outstanding Mid-Career Novelist Prize in 2009. Lowenthal's most recent book is a memoir and essays, Place Envy, published in 2026. He lives in Boston and Pittsburgh. Next we have C. Russel Price. C. Russel Price is the author of Oh, You Thought This Was a Date, Apocalypse Poems, and Tonight We Fuck the Trailer Park Out of Each Other. Their newest collection, Bisquick, An American Seance, will be published in August 2026 by Northwestern University Press. They are a poet in residence at the Chicago Poetry Center and work with the Anarchist Review of Books and Story Studio Chicago. They are a Lambda Fellow, Ragdale Fellow, Literary Death March Champion, and 2-time Lit 50 honoree. Price Landscapes in Chicago. And finally, I think we got one more. Douglas Sadownick, PhD, another doctor, is the author of Sacred Lips of the Bronx and Healing Gay Sex and Love. For more than 30 years, he has worked at the intersection of psychotherapy, community organizing, and cultural writing about the inner life of queer people. His A's-era novel, Sacred Lips of the Bronx, exploring the intersection of gay and Jewish experience, has been reissued by Rebel Satori Press in a 30-year commemorative edition. His psychological novel, Healing Gay Sex and Love, A Group Experience, edited by the late Felice Bacano, grows out of decades of group therapy and performance work. Sadownick founded the LGBT specialization in clinical psychology at Antioch University, LA. His next book, The G&Q Map, A Gay Guide to the Gay Hero's Journey, appears in April. Welcome, all of you.
Thanks, Trevor.
Okay, so to get started, I always think one of the first things I often think about is how do you guys deal in writing erotic material in your work with the sort of limited lexicon? In other words, we're always struggling with, what words do we use? There's sort of a handful of words for various genitalia, et cetera, or various behavior. How do you guys work with that in terms of not throwing the story off, or not being too self-conscious about throwing the story off, maybe, but sometimes the language doesn't always fit into the other part of what you're doing in a passage or a piece of work. Anybody have who wants to start?
I'll start. I love this one.
Yeah?
So it'll be more clear in the poems that I share, but I love leaning into that really fine line between absurd and just like as accurate and pornographic almost. Like I use a lot of flower languages anyway in like my life work, but then using it in an erotic poem to describe a cock is just a different way, and very tongue-in-cheek at the same time. Like it's very clear,
Yeah.
I want to be dirty.
Yeah. But natural imagery, that's a good point as well. Anybody else have comments on that? Yeah, Drew.
I think it's, so I don't write erotica, but I have very erotic scenes in
Yeah.
literary fiction. And so I think it's really important to choose language, even if you're not using the first person, that would feel like it's related to the characters that you're talking about. So if you're writing about a young character, using language that that young character would know about or hear to make it feel real to the reader, that this is language that would work in this scene.
Oh, that's a good point. Yes.
Make it feel real to the reader. I suppose one of the cool things about being a writer and a psychotherapist, people in therapy will say words all of the time that don't mean anything. They're like euphemisms, like, touch my, dick, or I saw his butt, like, well, but if you actually invite them to think, what are they really talking about? What are they really feeling? What do they really notice? There were little hairs there, or there was a little pimple, or it wasn't his cock, it was more how he touched my, so when you kind of get the real story underneath the word, then there's more, I don't know, what more layers or feeling. So it's just more like, also, what would the other people hear when they hear that word too? So then it becomes, you're really empathic to the reader.
Right, there's so much connotation
So
with
much
all these
connotation.
words.
Yeah, exactly.
So building more around it is helpful, yeah. That's good. Anybody else have a comment? You don't have to comment. But I think it also brings up this question that somebody had mentioned, the idea of sometimes it ends up sounding absurd or funny, and sometimes you want it to sound that way, and other times you don't, and there's nothing worse than writing like a sex scene that people start laughing at and you were being serious. And so, I think that there is an absurdity to sex when you're reading it, because when you're having sex, it seems like the most important, epic thing that's ever happened on Earth, right? But when you're reading about it, or, 10 minutes after sometimes or something, it sort of seems humorous, like this stupid thing people do, right? And so how do you guys deal with that in terms of, do you like to present it as sort of funny or absurd, or... And how do you deal with that fine line between, I don't want this to be funny, and I want to make sure I don't make it sound stupid or silly. I don't want people laughing at maybe a serious scene I'm writing around something erotic.
I think it's open to interpretation. I found I struggle with trying to be clean or be appropriate and just say it, because then you're going to have somebody say, thank you for just getting right to the point. So I think that we have to be, I've never considered myself an erotica writer, but I guess so. I blush when I read it, which probably happened today, because I feel that it's nasty, but at the same time it's relatable, and I like to see expressions of other people's faces when they hear it. And I think, I wrote Walk Like a Man. I wrote Walk Like a Man 20 years ago, so I'd be curious to see what I do today, because I've not looked at it in probably 10 years. So I want to see the room when I read this passage.
Yeah, and I'm going to have all you guys, I'm going to invite all you guys to read, because I think that's important, because this can get very, theoretical. We're talking, and so I think pretty soon we're going to do that. I think that
that'd be great.
You just suggested one more question, this idea of, because a couple of you have said that too, like, well, I don't write erotica, or, I'm putting, so it's the idea of integrating it, and I think, like, sometimes I've thought, I've written erotica, but it's like, in some ways, it's like, I'm just writing about life in this particular, there's a lot of erotica in this story, so it sort of begs this question of, how do we integrate it so it doesn't seem like I'm not just writing an erotic story or a sex story, I'm just writing about my life, and sex is part of it, and in some ways, literature and writing has the same issues as a society at large, but that's what's appropriate or what isn't appropriate, or you're not supposed to talk about that, and I think one thing that's cool in the queer community is we're more comfortable with our sexuality is kind of front and center a lot of times, so we write about it, and so I think so that's the question, I guess, like, how do you integrate it so it doesn't just seem like you're writing a sex piece, you're writing a piece that has sexuality as part of it, and maybe it's building character, maybe it's advancing the plot, maybe it's showing a conflict. It doesn't have to always be good, hot sex, it can be bad sex, right? Yeah, Doug?
So Felice Bucano, who died last year, and was my mentor, who wrote the revised edition of The Joy of Gay Sex with Charles Silverstein, had kind of figured out how, because he wrote this book about it, but also how the different ways that sexuality works in gay liberation, because we need it just to recover from all this trauma and this shame. But then there's this other problem I think you're alluding to of, without irony, it's piece of meat sex, which is always fun at the moment it's happening, but if you haven't, lubricated the reader or given them like a nice little kiss on the neck or some context, or maybe even the arc that goes from the instinct to the archetypal, which is always there, even in porn, but it doesn't have to be explicit. So I think the reader has to be aware, or the writer rather, has to be aware of how the reader's going to receive it, so that they prep them somehow, just through context or through feeling,
And I suppose there's a cultural context too, like with the advance of time, because I was just, it's the 50th anniversary of the Height Report. Remember, there was an article in New York about this I was reading this morning, and this idea of like, people didn't really write much about the female orgasm that she talks about and sort of unpacks. And in my erotica classes, they're predominantly women, and they write about this, that stuff that was really not written about before. A lot of times sex was sort of done quickly. Well, they had sex and da-da-da, and it's like, well, but how did it actually happen? And in some sense, it's a real male version of what sex is. We had sex and we had an orgasm or whatever. It's like, really? Did you really? And, it's like, did you understand how it's different for different people? And so, so the context is changing too.
It's not exactly a little too long at the corner pocket last night, I think. my voice is a little doggy.
Good to know.
Yeah.
Now I remember you.
I think I met you guys too. It's fun.
But in terms of the changing context, it's not exactly responsive to what you were asking before, but I feel like when I was younger, 30 years ago, starting writing, it felt so much more essential, especially as queer people, to put all this stuff on the page that was invisible largely in the culture, or had been invisible for a while. And now, everybody knows, but literally with the click of your keyboard, you can see a picture or a video of any sexual act that has ever been conceived of by a human being. And when that's so accessible to everybody, and even teenagers, whatever, for me, the challenge of the writing has really shifted, because I'm much more interested in writing that gives us what you can't see on Twitter or Pornhub or whatever, right? So a lot more internal, emotional, psychological, all that stuff. So to me, that's the other context change challenge.
That's
That's
good,
nice.
yeah.
What you can get.
Somebody else have a comment on that?
Or just like what he said about, since it's so available, how
Yeah.
writing can give you what you can't otherwise get. I like that. That's really good.
I would also add that that's important, especially in the kind of writing I do, getting into the head of the character of what's going on for that character during the sexual act is far more important than the sexual act itself. But having said that, I personally don't want to hold back from the sexual act, which is what they used to do in literary fiction, right? It would be like, oh, there's a sex act and here's the deep feeling from it, but what really happened? And when I published my first book in 2005, I sent it out. The reason I self-published is I sent it out to several agents, and one of them very explicitly said, it's too gay for a straight audience and it's too straight for a gay audience. So if you could either take the sex scene out of it, the big intense sex scene, or put a lot more sex into it, then it's not going to sell to either one of those audiences. Well, now we know from Heated Rivalry that's not the case, right?
Yeah, the context is changing, and like some of you guys have said, Doug and Michael, also the idea that we're educating people through this. So I think there is, whether we're intending to do that, there is something really educational. And this is what I feel like I'm learning from these women I'm working with in these classes too. It's like they're educating people about female sexuality that really, before whatever, maybe 50 years ago, there was hardly anything. It was like Lady Chatterley's lover, and she would say, I'm having my crisis. And then she has her crisis, and that's it, and they're like, what exactly was this crisis? And it's a weird word, but I always thought that
And it was enough to get the book banned for years.
Yeah,
Years.
yeah, even that, just calling it, somebody having a crisis was bannable, yeah. So it also kind of leads into this idea of, is there a difference to any of you between, sex writing, erotica, and porn? This is always like a good way to define terms, right? Because people sometimes get,
Oh, there's 3 categories?
well, there's probably more.
Erotica and porn?
But I think that's often what people consider. There used to be kind of porn and erotica, and I think sex writing has become this new thing that's kind of emerged in the last, 30 years or so, where it's somewhere in between. Because, the idea that porn often is a transactional kind of payoff thing. It's got to deliver something, right? Whereas erotica or sex writing is usually something, erotic often is considered prettier and more literary, and then sex writing is sort of that thing in between where it's like, well, this is what's really happening, what people, but do you guys have thoughts on that?
I don't see a separation.
You don't
but
see a
I think
separation,
it's mostly
yeah.
because I work in poetry.
Yeah.
So I'm already dealing with like re-navigating that definition of a form.
Yeah.
So then when I talk very graphically about gangbangs or whatever, it's working more with the idea of the line rather than the subject.
Yes. I think that's a good point. I think poetry helps because I write poetry too that can be seen as erotic, and it's like somehow it's a poem, so it's a literary thing. So somehow it gets to be erotic, and it's not porn, even though it's like this could be a pornographic poem, but no one thinks of poetry as pornographic because you don't go on Pornhub and read poetry generally.
So line breaks make it erotica.
Yeah.
or the prejudice about people hang up on poetry, right?
Chapter changes.
Yeah.
I guess I would say, I'll just give it, I don't want to go too long, but just a quick bit of background, because it wasn't in my bio and it's been so long, I'm sure nobody knows, but when I was in my early 20s, I had the great privilege and luck of being mentored by John Preston, who was an editor, writer, pornographer. He embraced that term. He had been editor of Drummer magazine, I think, and all that kind of stuff. And he did these, they were sort of the first mainstream anthologies of gay erotic writing, like Penguin, Viking, published them, and they were bestsellers and stuff. And he always made a huge point of saying erotica is just what people who are embarrassed to say porn is. Like, he made no distinction.
Yeah.
And when he died, I sort of inherited those projects from him, and he asked me to continue them. And so I became this erotica anthology editor in my 20s, which was lovely and fine, and it also made me a living, and it was great. But I feel sort of strange now, I can sort of admit, 30 years later, it wasn't ever really my personal thing, and when I took over the series, I changed it to memoir, right, like erotic memoir writing, the last few volumes. And I don't know, it's hard to explain, but somehow I thought people writing real stories about their sexual encounters and their fantasies or whatever, would get rid of some of what in porn to me was just a little, I guess it's that transactional things. Writing that has a capital P purpose of any variety usually leaves me cold. So like political propaganda in novels and stories or whatever, or sort of like moral literature. And so for me, the writing that the point of it is to get you off always leaves me flat. And I was always turned on much more by writing that just is like about other stuff, and then it's hot also, or like sex happens in it, and bad sex, funny sex, whatever. So that was my approach then. I turned it into like gay erotic memoir writing, and to me that got really weird and hot. And so I don't know if this is really answering the distinction question, but anyhow.
But yeah, it's not cut and dry. Go ahead.
I think what people are referring to as that maybe we can do that due to the need both to educate and to be activists. It's a kind of like integration that people maybe haven't talked about, but is maybe part of the art of being a queer writer. Michael was referring to it. I too actually was a judge for the Best Gay Erotica in 1997, which is like something I don't often put on my resume to get a PhD job, but I should. But I also made me think a little bit more about what is porn, because maybe some shame prevents us from really inquiring, but also as a psychotherapist, one of the complaints of many gay men is they have a quote-unquote porn addiction. So what is that? So something very under-analyzed about porn because of its hypnotic and compelling and aspects that are good to maybe figure out how to use some of those, because it gets a certain job done that we shouldn't be too wary about. But of course, by itself, it doesn't work outside of the context. But it shouldn't be demonized either, in my opinion. Anyway.
I don't think it should be demonized, but I mean, there is a difference. I mean, in my mind, do you fast forward to get to the money shot in your book or in the movie, or do you want to read or see the build up to the money shot? That is that's the distinction.
Got to try to do both if possible.
And especially in reading. I mean, reading is a different thing than viewing a video or something, right?
But I think both. I mean, if you think about soft porn in movies, or even, I mean, again, I'm going to bring up Heated Rivalry. Did you want to see the whole show, or did you just go to the sex scenes?
Right.
I wanted to see the whole show, and I think when I watch porn, I oftentimes, okay, let's just fast forward 15 minutes in. Yeah, good with that.
But the point that I guess we're both making is they didn't shy away in Heated Rivalry from giving us very long, I don't think I've ever seen anything like that before,
Right.
very long discursive
Right.
places where they're, having intercourse and, so that, but then you didn't want to rush it because there was something about the character development.
Exactly, yeah.
Well, sometimes I feel like you can almost chart it, like contextually, it's kind of moving like gender and sexuality. It's more, people see it more of a continuum, because my students will often bring up, why is there this binary between porn and eros, right? It's like, well, there isn't necessarily. Like, it is really more of a continuum, and I think people are seeing that more, just like gender and sexuality are more a continuum than I'm gay, I'm straight, which are you kind of thing. So that's, another contextual thing, I think. And then, of course, if we go back to the Greek words, right, like porno is related to the word for prostitution or whatever, whereas eros is this possession by eros, this god where you're just sort of in this sexual space, which is a very different thing than the definition of porn. But of course, words change over time, so no one's going back to Greek definitions on everything they do, right? I mean, we're using words all the time that started one way and have become something else, right?
I was thinking, since you're bringing up the Greeks, that maybe we could think of Plato in the Phaedrus, which is really the other gay one besides this. I mean, they're all gay. They're all homo, but in the Phaedrus, there's this image of the man who's writing to his beloved, and there's two reins, and one is the horse is the lustful one, I guess, another way of thinking of porn, and the other one is the one of no, don't go too far, because there's a real person there. So it's an interesting tug of war.
Yeah.
In the Phaedrus.
Well,
Yeah.
I think we've gone from Heated Rivalry to Plato. I think our work here is done.
Well, I think it's a good time.
Where's the after party?
And so we're getting so philosophical, it's time to read something, I think. I feel like, now we've been talking about it long enough where I think people want to hear, like, okay, what are those people writing? And then we can go back and do some final questions. So maybe like 5 minutes apiece, that would be like 25 minutes. We'll take this section. Is that
First.
You want to go first?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Okay, all right.
So just a little background. The next book is about a blue ghost horse and a ghost cowboy with substance issues who hunts down predators of the poor. So it's a fuck buddy rom-com across the country. So I'm just going to read 2 poems from it. Ghost Cowboy Origin Poem. He was born never to live in peace with himself and to prevent the rest of us from doing so. Faithful to who and for what? He came aware on how to let a girl down gently, no hands. Here are some facts about Ghost Cowboy. Middle name Cloud, uncut like a boxwood, untrimmed like a prairie, naturally musky like a jock's jock, hot like spit on a Nazi. There's nothing more American than a man with flashbacks, rage, fish eyes, and beggar hands. Bare minimum, an alleged latex allergy. He came from my sorrow and loves only me. Ghost Cowboy's got a hog thick as a Banksia blossom, a pearl of pre-bloom sitting right atop his pistol I've grown a liking to. He takes me out dancing every Saturday night and talks about me to his friends down at the tracks. He trashes Christmas cards from a hooker in Minneapolis. He's a ghost with a disregard for property laws and who you are when you're not wanting him. He went to war and came home replaced by a machine as sick as a dog with John Wayne syndrome. He came with the house and the car. He came to me one night, drunk like a song around me, said, I want to hear you with a little Kmart mouth and give you my Winchester justice. Things don't need to be like this, he said. We could live better. And then the next one that I think is the dirtiest thing I've ever written in my life. Like when I hit one of the metaphors that came up with it, I was like, Jesus Christ, Charlie Brown, like. So feel free to like guffaw or be like, what the fuck? But I think that's like what I love about writing about sex and poetry is where do you get uncomfortable? Ghost Cowboy has requested we take a break from this relationship while he goes to Omaha or wherever those cats are always going to, or Olima or Kathmandu, while he goes out there to find himself. Ghost Cowboy has pulled up again in his pickup truck, smelling like mane and tail. He looks at me like he didn't just catch me crying over some unremarkable cowboy in a capitalist pig's private garden. I say, who do I call out to now at 2 a.m. with a handful of my slick lonely? It's a sin, cowboy. To forget a scrawny twunk like that, the happy trail, the gutter, the goddamn gooch of it all would make a grown man cry. I'll drool and gooned like a cartoon fever dream, spank bank gold loot. I need to burn what I got, this quickie sent by God, my little creeper. My favorite little dime bag. I got the prairie ripping out of my heart. Just like me, a little rodeo clown, well loved in secret, but you gotta admit, when I got my heart ass up, face down for you, look at it. That charlatanical clownfish puckering, my mouth full of your hot chaos. I made a little room in me for you, and when I lockjawed your little ego in my fist and squeezed it like a clearance supermarket grapefruit, you turned your head, and I coughed right down your throat, and you loved it like a grandma. Like straddling a linebacker with your one wild and precious devil's pelvis fury.
Yeah, that's great. Awesome.
Yeah, when I came up with grandma, I was like,
yeah, the
motherfucker.
I know, and I think I'm going to remember my slick lonely. That was beautiful.
Yeah, that was good.
Laurinda, would you like to read something?
Yes, I will, but
Great.
please. I am 20 years older than what I was when I wrote this.
Okay.
And my wife and I have CPAP machines and things just a little bit different. So, let's see how this works for this evening.
That's hot.
The title of the
CPAP play.
chapter is Foreplay. And I just have to say that Walk Like a Man was a collection of short stories first, and then I turned it into a series of monologues into the play. And so when I actually saw the play being performed, I was like, I did not mean to be like that. I didn't mean for it to be like this. And okay, so here goes. The first time I lay naked with a woman, I was nervous but anxious to get it on. I had no idea what we were supposed to do. All I knew was that my vagina was throbbing fiercely, and she, in her nude state, looked so good to me. But hell, she had the same thing I had. And I felt since she was older, she would give me some direction. As I sat waiting for her to make her move, she was lying there waiting for me to make mine. So I leaned over and kissed her. It was a passionate kiss, full of tongue and juice, but there was no way that this could be what gay sex was all about. So she kept whispering for me to stick my dick in her. What dick? In my youthful innocence and desperately not wanting her to stop kissing me, I slowly slid my fingers between her legs and entered her. She started moaning, "Oh, that dick." I quickly found out that I could imitate a man's thrust with just my fingers. She wiggled on my index and forefingers like a big worm, and I amazed, with this newfound pleasure, because it did feel quite nice, moved my lips from hers and redirected my passion to her breast. Caressing them with my lips, I did to her what I knew had felt good to me whenever a man had sucked my nipples. She moaned some more, and before I knew it, she'd had an orgasm. So what about me? As she lay there stretched out on her mother's bed, I watched her chest rise and fall during her sudden slumber. Her nipples were still erect. She seemed comfortable. I, believing I'd done my part, rolled over into a fetal position and covered myself with the blanket. But what about me? Maybe an hour or so later, after I was no longer aroused, I felt a kiss on my neck. It was soft and gentle, wet and tender. The kisses continued down my spine, along my thighs, and ended at the tips of my toes. Flipping me over, she moved her lips up the front of my calves and spread open my legs. Her kisses, now longer and more succulent, generated this vibration in my lower abdomen that I'd never felt before. My eyes, fixated on her slender body as it slithered toward me, watered as she drew near. Anticipating her lips touching my private button, I jerked away and told her I wanted to stop. I couldn't envision getting my pleasure from someone pulling and tugging on that thing between my legs. Sitting in a huge wet spot created by my own moisture, I knew I wasn't ready for that kind of sex. I wasn't seeking my own gratification that night. I was merely satisfied with knowing I could get a woman off like a man could, and with no dick. I will say that our lovemaking was one of the most intense events of my life, but during the whole thing, I found myself wanting to be a man with this huge dick planted inside her nature. I was on top of her like my past boyfriends had been on top of me, working it and stroking it like a champ. And when I came, the muscles in my back tensed up and released myself in her. That whole night, I felt this power, this aura about myself that I'd never felt before. Resting between her legs while embracing her torso, I tickled her breast with my tongue. She begged for me to enter her again, and I did, but not with 2 fingers, try 3. The butt of dawn caught me racing through the streets across town, trying to make it home to get ready for work. And then as I pulled into my driveway, it hit me. I spent an entire night with a woman, consumed with the idea of me being a man, the idea of me having a dick, the idea of me fucking her was something God didn't give me. The irony of the whole thing is that I felt like I had one. I felt like that shit was real. I went into the house and took a quick bubble bath, and afterward I sprayed myself with perfume. I put on my tightest skirt and my highest heels and strutted back out to the car with my face beat. On the way to work, I thought about my new sexual freedom and quietly laughed to myself. I checked my lipstick in the rearview mirror as I reached in the back seat for my purse. Delicately picking the lint off my skirt, I admired my gentle strokes against the fabric. Every part of me was meticulous, down to the color of my lingerie that was forever on point with my outerwear. My nails are always punctiliously manicured and polished to coordinate with my toes. On the outside, I walked on the tips of those toes, dainty and self-assured, bouncing my long, thick hair from side to side. I looked every bit of a lady to the world. I had it eating out of the palm of my hands, but on the inside, though down beneath the smooth skin, the soft fragrance, I walked like a man.
It makes me think of, that inner monologue we have going on too, which people often don't write about, like, what dick? Oh, that's going on in our own head, that you don't necessarily describe, which I think is, and it's something you can do in the first person POV, right?
Yes.
Which, in the third would be different. And I love your image of her nature. That was cool, because again, you got out of the lexicon trap of what words do I have?
Trevor, it's 20 years
Is that
ago.
But that's
memoir-
great.
Is that memoir erotic?
I don't know. I would never tell. I never tell.
Tell me later.
Yeah, tell her.
That's my wife.
Yeah,
That's my wife.
thank you, Loretta. That was great. Who wants to go next? 3 of you down there.
I'm happy to.
I'll go.
Okay, Drew.
So the scene I'm going to read was a bit challenging to write because, first of all, it involves an underage boy. He's 17. And I was very clear I didn't want it to be erotic, but I wanted it to be intense. It's also a scene where he has come to age through his dreams with a fascination of suffocation because his father drowned and he dreams of drowning. And so he gets confused about drowning and sex, and he finds this theme night called Submerge in a bar. He has no idea it's a gay bar, and he goes as a 17-year-old boy and convinces the bouncer to get in. Uncomfortable in the bar, he walks to what he thinks is a back exit door, and it's not. So that's the setup. It was a separate room, dark, hot, foul-smelling, with an insistent beat reverberating from its depths like the rumble of an approaching train. Paolo did an instant about-face, bumping into what must have been one of the guys who entered the room in front of him. "Sorry," Paolo said, as he searched for the door handle. The guy replied with a guttural sound, half growl, half guffaw, grabbing Paolo by the forearm and pulling him deeper into the darkness. Paolo jerked away, pushing through a cluster of bodies to find the wall. He frantically groped his way back toward the door, but became disoriented, finding himself deeper in the room where the thumping beat grew louder and more ominous. His eyes began to adjust, and he was scanning the room for the door when a neon sign flashed from the wall directly across from him. It read, "Submerge," flashing for just an instant, but Paolo had been looking straight at it, and the light burned his retinas. In that instant, he saw multiple bodies writhing around him, boxing him in, and he was blinded, and then he was blinded, and all went black. He panicked and began scrambling back down the wall as disembodied hands fondled his body, sliding under his shirt and across his skin like the nets, untethered ropes of his dreams. And as in the dream, a visceral fear overcame and aroused him. The submerge sign flashed again, and though the minimal peripheral vision he'd recovered, he saw he was still surrounded by a sea of flesh. One man, fully naked and erect, reached into the waistline of Paolo's jeans and yanked him back. The man held Paolo tightly around the waist, using his free hand to force his way into Paolo's jeans, reaching into his underwear and grabbing Paolo's dick. "Stop it," Paolo screamed. Except it wasn't a scream. It was an inaudible whisper. He made no attempt to remove the man's hand, which now clutched his balls. Paolo grimaced as his dick began to rise. Horrified by his body's betrayal, he finally twisted free and stumbled toward the exit sign he'd spotted above the door. He followed its faint glow red, squeezing through a mass of slippery flesh. The closer he got to the door, the more impassable the crowd became. Indiscriminate, sweaty bodies pressed into him from all sides, making it hard to breathe, arousing him further. He was steps from the door when suddenly the exit light vanished. The room was now pitch black, overwhelming him with claustrophobic dread, the extent of which he'd only experienced in his dreams. He gasped for air as his erection continued unabated. He felt the folds of his foreskin pull taut as the tip of his penis pushed up and out his underwear. Behind him, the submerged sign flashed a third time, its aura framing an immense shadow blocking his path to the door. The shadow reached down and grabbed Paolo's dick, which was now protruding out the waistline of his pants. He froze as the man deftly unbuttoned Paolo's jeans, yanking them down around his knees while jacking him off with the free hand. Other hands now caressed his bare thighs and ass as the man's calloused hand pistoned methodically up and down the shaft of Paolo's penis to the rhythm of the pulsating bass. Paolo closed his eyes and, as in the dream, surrendered. He was about to come when the man abruptly forced him to face the back of the room. The man's hands were no longer deft as he painfully gripped Paolo's shoulders and bent him over so his bare ass was fully exposed. Paolo didn't resist. He felt the hypersensitive skin of his erection in the man's hands, the rough texture of his Levi's jeans grinding into his ass, the pounding beat in his ears, the stink of sweat, and now the musky taste of a dick suddenly thrust in his mouth. Paolo gagged. He couldn't breathe and felt like he was on the verge of passing out when the cold sting of a huge metal belt buckle slapped against his thigh. When the man entered him, it felt like a hot poker had been shoved up his ass. It was unbearable. Paolo screamed, this time out loud. The disembodied hands recoiled. The only ones that remained were the two on his shoulders, gripping so tightly that his collarbones would be bruised. Thrusting his dick all the way in, Sam bent over and whispered in his ear, "Paolo, is it? Glad to make your acquaintance." Paolo dissociated. He was back in the dream, struggling to breathe as the nets tightened around him, the room fading with his consciousness. He came just before he collapsed.
Powerful, yeah.
Intense.
You know, and interesting, because another question, I don't know if we'll get to it, but I'm glad you read that piece, because I was thinking, you know, we also need to write about difficult or traumatic things, and I like the other level where it's like, he wants it, he doesn't want it, right? Because you have a physical body that responds, and yet he's also got things going on psychologically, and then the reality. That was great.
I mean, one of the things I was trying to explore there is, even in consensual, highly sexualized spaces, what do they do when someone naive or with trauma in their background walk into that space?
Yeah. So settings are interesting context, yeah. Doug or Michael, you guys want to read?
Either way. No.
I guess I'll go.
No, yeah, sure.
I love the variety here. This is great. These are three incredibly different pieces.
Delicious.
So I'm going to actually read from the novel, which is Sacred Lips of the Bronx. There's because it's relevant for the panel, and there's a secret I've never told anybody because I was in analysis when I wrote it, and I'm going to tell you. It's actually revealed in this book, but I'll tell you. And won't make any sense, but it will eventually, which is that in Jungian psychology, there's the idea of the sacred marriage, right, between the opposites. And it's usually depicted as a king and a queen. Well, I decided why couldn't it be between two young men? So that's the sacred marriage. Anyway, sorry, I had to give you a little piece of esoterica or erotica. So this is an encounter between Mikey, who's the Jewish protagonist, and Sacred Lips of the Bronx, and Hector, his Puerto Rican boyfriend. They're connecting. Let's see. Our bodies were never reticent. I recall us holding hands while rummaging through the school library stacks, rubbing our lips delicately against each other's for 20 minutes until we both came with kitten-like pants. We blew air in each other's mouths. We calibrated the breaths the way musicians do when playing sweet love songs. Our musical bridge often came in the form of turning away from each other to steady ourselves. Then we make invisible smoke circle in each other's throats. His basketball breath had an intoxicating shiver to it. Then there was the time when we grabbed each other's crotches in an empty locker room. The harder we tugged, the more attuned to ticklish sensation our dicks got. Over a period of 10 minutes, we yanked more and more, gauging plateaus by the gravelly moans each of us made when we seemed to hit a wall. At one point, I felt I was losing my testicles. I began to black out from the pain. That's when I came, like a thunderstorm, this time the lightning following the roaring cracks in the distance. Hector covered my mouth with his free palm. By accident, I bit it. Puta barata, he muttered. Then he put my hand to his mouth and came himself in his green gym shorts. "Hey, Mikey," said this mystic Stan Laurel, "another fine mess we got ourselves into." He scooped the jism from his stomach like a yolk that had missed the cookie batter. Instead of throwing the goo in the trash can, he licked it up. I was too stunned to resist when he provided me with my first taste of what Hector called little baby Hectors. I had never been particularly oriented to certain parts of my body, nipples, asshole, the spaces between the asshole and the balls. Hector showed me all about them. Through the delicate use of his forefinger, he'd wake up areas like the nipples with a drip of spit and fortitude. "It's like an old creaking engine," he'd say. "You got to give it some oil." My flat brown nipples began to stand up on end as if I had just emerged from a swimming pool on a cool day. Hector had a theory that on a man, the nipples were the place God put the skin that he couldn't fit on the dick. Hector called it the theory of the three dicks. And by applications of breath and at first barely perceptible caresses, he confirmed his theory to me. He was not so lucky. In other areas, the first time he ever so lightly fingered my asshole, I nearly jumped off his bed, screaming so loud his mother had to ask, "Hector, ¿qué pasó?" For some cultural reason, I suppose, I had a pathological distaste for that area in my body, and up until then had felt ridiculously unclean if I couldn't shower and shampoo after a bowel movement. Hector, who usually would laugh at my little obstinacies, found himself impatient with what he called "your crazy mixed-up ethnic fears." Before I could put on my shorts, he cornered me in his room, half Nelson me down to his linoleum floor, and straddled my arms with his body and legs. I could have screamed, I could have bolted up, I could have bit his hand. By the same token, I didn't give in that easily. To his credit, Hector didn't edge himself further inside of me than my opening was willing to allow. In 20 minutes, I guessed he had 2 fingers in, but who, after all, was counting? He relaxed his own position and lay next to me for the first time. I felt as if I were breathing from other parts of my body besides my nostrils. I relaxed into the viscera tundra of sensation. Something inside my chest seemed to pop, not so much from the pressure in my ass, but in the release of pressure in my lungs. That is when I think Hector inserted his third and final finger. I cried. I was embarrassed. He was tickled. Now, he said, vibrating his fingers inside, "You are a man." "What are you?" I asked, "my fucking rabbi?" Afterward, Hector let himself go with me, astounded at how far we could fly together. "Damn, we're fucking animals," he'd say. "Birds," I'd answer.
I noticed you brought up music in the beginning too, and music is another thing like nature that is a wonderful erotic sort of vehicle to use, or image bank, if you will. Yeah, and I like how you went from cookie batter, the kind of micro, to the tundra of sensation. The tundra of sensation is awesome too because it's the expansive image. I love that. Yeah.
Can I just say, as a 20-something little gay Jewish boy working on my first novel, it was just totally, incredible and transformative when that book came out, Doug. And it's just, to be here 30 years later and hear you read from it is amazing.
That's awesome. Thank you.
That was great.
Thank you. Fellow queer Jew, thank you.
Not to interpret my own work, but I was just going to, before I read, say that I used to rail against, back in those days and when I was editing these erotic anthologies, what I called the cut to the characters having a post-coital cigarette cop-out, where you don't describe the sex at all, and then just white space, and then it's post-fucking. And now in my old age, I've actually completely flipped and often embraced that, and so you'll see that I actually, and what I'm going to read, I skip the actual sex and try to write about everything around the sex. And I think I use the word cock, but I literally describe what's around the cock, but not the cock itself. And that's what's interesting me most lately. So this is from my new book. It's a memoir, and it's about being in the northeast of Brazil. And I go and I cruise a gay bar there. I'll just say here. Then a shout in Portuguese. "You alone?" I turned to find 2 guys in chairs against the concrete wall. One was chubby with puggish eyes. The other, shockingly lean, had thick black hair and brown skin so smooth I was sure he'd never shaved. A single dimple flashed in his cheek. So he tried again. "You alone?" His youthful chutzpah made him almost painfully my type. I sat beside him and said, "Not anymore." His name was William, and his pal was Leo. He poured me some beer, then ordered another outsized bottle, dismissing my offer to pay. "The book is on the table," was the only English he knew, a line from a long-ago school lesson, and so we had to make do with my scanty Portuguese, learned from CDs I'd borrowed before the trip. As Leo sulked, his love for William leaking from every pore, William and I vacuumed up facts about each other. 23, although he could have passed for 17, he had moved to the city that year, hoping to go to college and learn law. Hearing that I was 38 and a university teacher, he nodded with apparent satisfaction. "When I saw you," he said, "I made myself a promise. If he comes by again, I'll say something. Normally I am not so brave." "Liar," I said, and goosed his side. "I'm shy," he insisted unshyly. "A boy from the interior." The town where he'd grown up, he said, was 10 hours' drive by bus. His left forearm, smooth as his jaw, sprouted just one hair. I saw him not as a law student, but as a cocky, moxie for miles newsboy in a classic film. William bought another round, and I got up to piss. When I returned, he was standing, asking if I was ready. With Leo scowling, we hurried off, William bouncing along on his toes as if overeager to greet the future. At the hotel, I said I was sorry for its nature, but William, taking in the mirrored ceiling, the looping porn, a basket of rubbers and lube for sale, gave my shoulder a flippant punch. When we grow old together, he said, we will always remember our first night. He cackled at his own joke, and I was laughing too, smitten by his easy confidence. After sex, we studied each other. Peli Jamel, he murmured, stroking my honey skin. I stroked his skin too, a burnished-looking bronze, but I was too nervous to comment. I'd read a piece about Brazilians' racial attitudes, including a list of 136 variations of skin color. I wasn't sure how to ask him how he identified. I asked instead about his tattoo. Just beside his cock, in a Speedo-shaped patch of unsunned skin, a turquoise dolphin caught in joyful leap. What's this color in Portuguese? I asked. He said turquesa. Undulating his hips, he made the dolphin swim, and then we were laughing again, then kissing. Kissing him was like discovering I could breathe underwater, a blue infinity. I never wanted to surface.
You know, I like how you brought up the fantasy of the newsboy too, because that's often part of the whole anticipatory erotic thing, right? I mean, you've got the cowboys, right? And you know, I love that punch too. Sometimes these little subtle things are super erotic. The little punch, as you know where these guys are heading, it's totally sweet kind of physical connection, right? And then I also like how you brought up the self-consciousness about racial issues in Brazil or something, because, you know, you're with his body, and it's almost like what you said, Doug, about, like, you know, you're both a puta barata, and you're also asking him if he's your rabbi. You know, I mean, these funny little kind of ethnic consciousness thing, because you're in this really intimate thing, and these are the intimate realities of life, and you you had to avoid it by going to the tattoo, right, because they're there.
No, it's going back to the contextual change of how you can see everything online. I mean, so even more, I feel like what I want in writing is all the stuff you can't see visually, because we're in such an overwhelmingly visual culture now. And so, yeah, things like racial negotiation or cultural negotiation, that kind of stuff, because that's where you don't really see that in a Pornhub video. You know?
Yeah. It's super interesting, and I live in Mexico, and a lot of times I'll notice, like, oh wow, your wrists are so small, your kneecaps are so much tinier than what I'm used to, you know, but it's like, it sounds really stupid to like be saying these things, you know, you're dealing with people who are physically different, you know, but it's interesting because you're just super aware of it, right? I mean, you're aware of each other's bodies. So I think that what we all just read here has probably provoked a lot of thought. So I wonder if you guys have things to say about anything that came up during what we just did here, because I don't want to miss anything, and we're going to miss things because this is a huge topic. But
I loved hearing from folks who've been writing erotica a bit longer than me, and how their focus has changed over time of wanting the money shot or the anticipation, or to not write about the post-coital. And I have a poem in the book called Things I Shouldn't Say to Ghost Cowboy Post-Coital, and it starts with "You've been thunderstruck," and talking about the ickiness of sexual writing. And I love that. I'm excited to see what my proclivities change over time, because it's my first book dealt with sexual trauma, and folks kind of talked more about that than the racial or class commentary that I was making, and that was their focus. So this one to be a joyful exploration of sex with a ghost is a different fucking in that way.
yeah, cool.
I have a question.
Yes.
So, is writing like intentional? Like, when I did Walk Like a Man, I just wrote. It wasn't meant to be erotica. I actually think I was offended when somebody said that it was. And I was like, well, that's not what I was trying to do. I was telling stories, you know. And so when I'm listening to you all, I'm like, that's a lot. You know, I have visuals. You know, I'm sorry. I have visuals. I'm normal. I like women and everything, but shit, I'm normal. So as writers, from an erotica standpoint, do you go into stories to share experiences as colorfully or as beautifully as you can, or are you just writing what I think is going to sell?
I think it's completely intentional of where I'm really obsessed with, like the book starts with why I'm writing about a ghost cowboy I yell at a punk house at 2 a.m. And it's not a job, it's an identity. And there's something so political about why I chose this to be the beloved in the collection and what that says about his own attraction to the speaker in the book. So yeah, I think it's a million times intentional. Like I even think like if I'd written about motorcyclists or some other stereo or archetype of gay fantasy, it wouldn't be as exciting if I didn't have the class, the race, and cultural backing that comes with a cowboy character, especially from Chicago.
Yeah, and how you build, I mean, I read your Bisquick manuscript before, I was fortunate to see it, and just all the different, like using cowboys, a thing, and there's all these different, there's like the mini mart manager cowboy, you had all these different and I loved it because it's like the cowboy could be anything. I mean,
Yep.
the cowboy is an incredible archetype too, and especially an American archetype, I think that we're all familiar with, and you kind of renew it and refresh it, so I love that.
Thank you.
I mean, I would say, I wish I wrote what was going to say. I mean, my character's bisexual, all the sex is problematic. I mean, I'm like, who is my audience here? I definitely write from the story. Absolutely, sex is just what happens to get the story there. I mean, one of the things I loved in your piece, really loved, is that you carried on for half of your reading after the sex and how it changed her and the feeling of how she approached the world. I love that, like dressing up as a highly feminized woman and walking like a man. I thought that was, I'm not answering your question there, but I want to give you a compliment.
Thank you. Yeah, I got you.
And I'm from Memphis too, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, good chance.
I mean, I would say that I share your thing. I wish I wrote what would sell, but my stories often are about a problem that I can't stop thinking about, and I have to sort of resolve it through telling myself the story and figuring out the story. And just because sex is interesting and exciting and problematic and all the things it is, those problems I want to work out in stories often involve sex, but that's not really like the goal. And like what I just read from, that was like a nice encounter in it, but the actual piece is I ended up having an affair with that guy in Brazil for a few years, and on what ended up being the last morning after I said goodbye to him, I was taking the bus to the airport, and I got cruised by a guy on the bus in Brazil, and on the way to the airport, and we started fondling each other on the bus, and I missed my plane.
Good erotic story right there.
But in my mind, I was like, wait. So I had a partner already in the United States, so I was already having an affair with this guy in Brazil, and we had this tearful goodbye, and then minutes later, I'm having this thing with the guy on the bus, and I was like, who am I? What the fuck is this? Why? And so then it's about trying to figure out these layers of I wasn't getting something that I wanted in my relationship in Boston, so I was having this thing in Brazil, and then clearly I wasn't getting enough from that, so I was hooking up on the bus, and it drove me crazy for years. What had I become? Not there's anything wrong with cruising on the bus or whatever, but emotionally, it wasn't who I wanted to be at that moment. And so I had to like keep unpacking all those layers. And so it had to involve some sex because these were sexual relationships. But that wasn't like the point, you know what I mean? Even if like the part that I read, the point of that is, yeah, that was our first hookup and it was fun and all that, but yeah.
But it's a really good point about how writing about erotica or sexuality is like, this is character development, right? Because you've got this character who's like, what the fuck am I doing? And a lot of times we don't really get it, like, why am I attracted to this person, or da-da-da-da. And so that can be a really interesting area in developing a story and developing character connections and conflict and such, right?
I had an interesting thought that was coming when everybody was speaking that is so, I think, obvious, but because we're gay, lesbian, queer, bi, trans, but queer, sex operates differently for us. Of course, sex is always the way, especially for adolescents, that they become who they are and they fall in love or they develop an identity different from their parents. But for us, it is the engine that allows us to differentiate from the heterosexual collective. So it's more than the sum of its parts. It's a great power. I was feeling that especially with everybody, but with Laurinda's writing, that it was the means by which the two women discovered who they were, and the protagonist in the story had developed a kind of almost a new identity. So I don't know. I think that is maybe not discussed enough that for us sex is a symbol of transformation in a way.
Yeah.
And so we felt that with everybody.
Yeah, it's a great point, because, we often feel defined by it, and so it becomes something that I also think we sort of explored and learned to understand it better, because it is like this sort of problem for us at some point, and then it becomes a whole area of exploration, then becomes something other than a problem, becomes kind of this rich, amazing adventure, right, that maybe a lot of heterosexual people don't ever have that experience, you know. So we have about 15 minutes left, so I want to open this up to questions, but before I do, I always like to ask people, do they have favorite erotica? So like, I know I hate the idea of like, what's your favorite book? Like, especially for writers, it's a terrible question. You're like, oh, do you have time for a list of 100? But how about two? Like, pick two. Like, I would just say Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye it's a difficult story about sex, but it's, like you said, Laurinda, it's about the beauty and wonder of it, sort of, at the same time. It's an amazing book. And the imagery is really good. And then the other would be Tom Spanbauer, who passed away a few years ago, was a gay or bisexual writer, and I think his writing of erotica in all his books is really good. But I'll invite you guys to share a couple authors that have either influenced you or that you just like a lot, because it'll be helpful to the whole audience to hear.
I'd put Giovanni's Room as like number one influence for me, of just like wanting to get to the heat of it the way he does, and describing the sexual want between them. Like I read that book almost every year. And then I also really love reading Samantha Irby's memoirs of like, oh, no thank you, or we're not meeting in real life, just because she does such humorous approach to IBS and fucking all kinds of bodily things. That those, I find the humor more inspirational than just like Garth Greenwell or some other erotic writers.
Oh, great.
I think,
Laurinda?
I would probably say The Color Purple, simply because
It's a beautiful story.
that relationship happened at a time when we should not have existed. And I've seen it, well, I've read it, of course, and I've seen it performed a couple of times, I've seen the film. And so the way that it's portrayed, it was portrayed on Broadway with Cynthia Erivo, I think it was Jennifer Hudson in that particular show. It was unique. You know, it was taboo, but at the same time, it was letting the world know that this was real. And of course, if you all read the book, you understand that they went much deeper than what we actually saw. So I don't know if you want to call it like erotica like that, but The Color Purple, and then I would also say Zane, any of Zane's work. Zane was my publisher when I was with Simon & Schuster, and I told her stuff was too nasty. I couldn't read it because it was nasty, but it sold. You know, it made money, made millions of dollars. And so I think that culturally, when we think about erotica, I know in Black culture, a lot of it's taboo because we're not supposed to be doing that. You know, we're not supposed to be sharing that. Everything that we do is private. It's in private. And I live in Mississippi, even though I work down here. Same type of culture. You know, what you do at home is supposed to be kept at home. However, everybody knows what you're doing at home. And right. And so I think from an erotica standpoint, I think we have to go from a cultural dynamic and figure out, you know, what's allowed, where the boundaries exist. And so like, it's okay to talk about Zane and Addicted, very good movie, very good plot and everything, but it showed Black women at a very vulnerable state, and we have a hard time separating vulnerability from promiscuity, and we always find it to be something different than just erotica. We always got to find the underlying stories. Everybody wants to find the trauma in it, and it doesn't really have to go that deep. Sex is sex.
I would toss into the ring my sadly departed dear friend Mark Merlis. His novels, American Studies and In Arrow's Flight, were just filled with incredibly interesting, hot sexual stuff and other stuff. By a factor of 10, my favorite gay sex story of the last 10 years is actually by a straight writer, Tony Tulatumute, in his collection Rejection, which came out last year. It would be too much to explain, but trust me, it's incredible. And the last one I'll say is Douglas Stewart, who lots of people know from his...
Phil Andrews.
No, that's Sam Stewart. This is Douglas Stewart, who the Scottish writer who won the Booker Prize for Shuggie Bain. But he has a short story called Found Wanting that was in the New Yorker, and it's not very sexy. I'm just going to read 2 lines because I just love it so much. But it using sex for other stuff. So it's like a 17-year-old kid's first time ever having gay sex, and he meets this much older guy and goes home with him, and he says, and the guy's like wants to get fucked by the kid. I was not prepared for the lonely expanse of his back. His face was cradled in his hands, and he braced himself on his elbows. It was the same way my mother cried on the carpet in the mornings after a bad blackout, penitent, pitiable. I mean, like,
It's just
what the fuck?
a lot going on there, yeah.
Anyway, highly recommended.
That's a great little erotic moment, yeah.
Yeah, super hot.
Yeah. Heavy and hot, yeah.
I'll say they're neither erotica books. One is Jeanette Winterson,
Oh, yeah.
Passion.
Yeah.
I just love, it's not
That's awesome.
erotic, but it's super sexy,
Yeah.
and her characters are strange and wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
I think she's a brilliant writer. The other one's also by a female writer. It's In Memoriam, also not erotica. It's a debut novel about 2 guys that fall in love in the trenches of World War I, and it's sort of brutal.
Who was the
and
author?
I don't know her name, but
Okay. Alice Wynn.
thank
Okay.
it's unbelievable.
It's on my shelf.
I think for me, as a kid growing up in the Bronx, I had to hide. I bought the Howard Experiment, but I had to hide my interest, and I found that I could read the classics and no one would know it. And, believe it or not, Faulkner is very nasty, and so is Proust. So, you know, I was considered the most geeky of kids that I was reading, but it was a secret kind of like way of getting a sense as to what's going on really. And then, of course, later Jean Genet.
Yeah, yeah. Well, great, thank you, guys. So we've got a few minutes for some questions, so I want to open this up to, does anybody have some questions for the panelists? Yes?
Hi, this is kind of a logistical question, but I have tried a few times to write a sex scene that involves several people who use the same pronouns, and it's an absolute nightmare, which I would imagine we have all dealt with here in some capacity. Do you have kind of talking sort of as well about like the language thing about bodies? Like, do you have a way of doing things that prevents it from just like being a repetition of names and pronouns over and over again? Do you have any advice on that front?
It's such a good question.
Yeah, and especially in,
And it's so hard. Read it out loud. Read it out loud and see how it hits your ear.
That's what I was gonna say, and you brought this up as well, is that the reader doesn't know I'm in a trans body until I say I'm trans in the poem, and don't know my pronouns in the poem. And so to have multiple folks of cowboy lineage in it, I give them different nicknames of like Old Navy store supervisor cowboy, like a closet Republican cowboy, just all kinds of ways of tricking the reader to follow me. Because even though I know who the fuck everyone is in it, they're still gonna be like, wait. And if alone, like pronouns are already confusing, it's just gonna get even more complicated. But I think reading it out loud for sure. And even formatting it to where like in parts of the poem, I'll have like, this is the speaker on this part, this is there, so that way I can visually separate my folks.
So you know what I would do, but it's more, that's more kind of, elegant, is I would think of what is each other person experiencing. So, because that would all be really different, what each member of the orgy is experiencing.
any other thoughts, folks, for that question?
When you figure that out, like write an essay about it and publish it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah.
We don't
But I
want to know.
think, good point about the more names, the better, right? Because then you got more to go to, right? Anybody else have a question? Yes, Andrew.
Sort of an observation and a question, but I thought it was so impressive, the variety of kind of ages that we heard people, and the sort of the high school kid. It seemed like, sort of the professional coming out maybe a little later, the cowboy ghosts. In terms of sort of getting into the headspace of a different age that you're at, or if you have different characters in a book, let's talk a little bit about getting, writing the way that you would write as a teenager when you're, 40 or 50. And what's the challenges there?
Well, I will say that this last book was the protagonist, not because he was young. I mean, I've said this in other interviews. I don't relate to this protagonist, which is sort of fascinating to write a protagonist that you don't relate to. I mean, I've had a bisexual past. I should relate to him, but I mean, asphyxia doesn't draw me in the slightest. So writing about that, I really had to go intellectually and say what could happen if someone became and intermixed a fascination with asphyxia and sexuality. And it was challenging, but I had to stay in my head.
I'm like 14 in my mind perpetually, so it's not tough for me to do that. But, and I'm trying to think if I've tried to write sort of, older than I am experiences sexually. I don't think I have yet. And I think that's the great underdeveloped realm in our culture. There's a wonderful short story collection called Scary Old Sex by a woman, a straight cis woman, I think, but she writes, for me, totally mind-openingly about sex as a senior citizen, basically, because that's so, as I said, so few people write about that. Ed White, towards the end of his life, wrote a lot about that in interesting ways, and maybe it's part of the, thing, at least from the gay male side, of having lost, a couple of generations of writers from AIDS, that we don't have as many examples yet of writing about that, but I think we're getting there because a lot,
Because we're aging.
because we're aging, yeah.
Because it's real.
I used so much research for mine, like I used like the Logger's Dictionary and did so much research into seance work, and I live right across from the Leather Archives in Chicago, so they're a really fantastic resource on fetish and kink writing. So like, even though I was trying to write about a phantasmic spirit from another period and all this other shit, I was able to like give it coloring that made it more interesting, or at least not fuck butt shit, you know? It had to have weight to how he said things.
Just really quickly, like I said, this book was written 20 years ago, and I think that in the mind space that I was in at that time, I was all over the place. And so to answer the question about memoir, erotica, well, maybe. But 20 years later, I see things a totally lot differently than I would see them today. Probably would still handle the situation about the same. However, with maturity becomes more responsibility. It becomes more, sex becomes more protected at this age. And, you know, I've learned, I've been married for 15 years, and I've learned that I love my wife more because we don't have sex that often. I get to know more about her, and she knows more about me, you know. And so I would write from a different perspective at this stage of life. And so in thinking about from a generational standpoint and trying to identify with a particular age group, I probably would ask my children. My son is trans, so I'd probably ask him about his, you know, perspective on things. But my kids call me boring now because we go to the casino, we do stuff that normal people do, and sex never comes up, you know, as often as it used to. We're both old and fat, and stuff gets in the way. It's hot, you know. So we find things. You know, we bought dogs. Hold up, wait. Let's fix that. She has her puppies and things like that, and I have my writing and my career now. So we find ways to make up for it. So I think if I had to write from a different place, you know, in my mind, biologically, I'm much different than I was 20 years ago. Much different than I was 20 years ago.
Yeah, because don't you think the erotic sort of spreads out from not just sex, you know, when
Yeah.
you're 18 or something, it's like, duh. And then it sort of spreads out into like your whole life, and you start to see it. In fact, John Preston said all friendship is erotic.
Yes.
And I think that's a really interesting idea, because there is always this eros all over the place.
Eros.
You know, maybe these curtains, you know,
Excellent.
whatever. It's there. It doesn't have to be just the
Right.
sexual act.
Right, you have to be, even like now, if I'm thinking about her, I'm you know, sensationalized by it. It's very sensitive thinking about her and the things that make her happy, things that make us happy, as opposed to, you know, what we're not doing at night. You know, postmenopausal women is just not on our minds like it used to be. And I think that we as a culture begin to focus more on the individual and that thing that attracted us to that person or attracts us to that person, that we would find more beauty in sex whenever it happens, because now I'm in love with the total person.
Yeah.
Okay, total person.
That's a great note to end it on.
Yeah, beautiful.
So thank you all for coming.